She stood on the platform for 11 full seconds before anyone said a word to her. And later, when people in that town talked about the day she arrived, that was the detail they kept coming back to. Not the trunk, not the cold, the stillness of her. Her name was Adaline Foss, 28 years old, and 3 days earlier she had been sleeping in a rented room above a dry goods store in St. Joseph, Missouri, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake answering an advertisement she'd found folded into a newspaper someone left on a train seat. Now she was standing in Thistledown, Montana territory, population somewhere under 400 depending on the season, and the mistake, if it was one, had already been made. The train had come in at 2:30, and the cold that rolled off it found every seam in her coat and settled there like it meant to stay through spring. The platform held a rancher loading freight, 2 women from the church league, and a boy with a wagon and no expression at all. They all looked at her the way people look at something they intend to discuss later. A woman alone, 1 trunk, a face that gave up nothing. She picked up the trunk by its single working handle and walked toward the street before the cold could talk her out of it. The advertisement had run in 3 papers, the one in Missouri, one out of Cheyenne, one out of Denver, and it had been short enough to feel almost impolite. Cattle operation, Thistledown, Montana territory, seeking a capable woman for the winter season. Room and board provided. Right to Box 9, Thistledown Post Office. It hadn't mentioned marriage at all. That had come in the reply, plain as a grocery list in the second paragraph. A formal arrangement, legally registered, for the winter or longer, should both parties agree it served them. Whoever had written it either didn't know how to dress up a proposal, or had decided the dressing wasn't worth the ink. She found, standing on that platform with her boots already going numb, that she respected the second explanation more than the first. He was waiting at the post office instead of the platform, which told her something before he'd said a single word. Tall, a hat that had clearly been good once, years back. He looked at her the way a man looks when he's quietly revising a number in his head. "You're smaller than the letter made you sound," he said. "The letter didn't mention my height," she said. "I assumed that meant it wasn't a requirement." He studied her another beat, then bent and took the trunk from her without asking permission, and she let him have it. Because arguing over a trunk in 9°, weather struck her as a poor use of the daylight she had left. They didn't talk on the walk to the wagon. The first snow started before they'd cleared the last building on the street. Small, dry flakes that vanished the second they touched anything, though more kept coming behind them, patient about it. She pulled her collar up and did not look back at the town shrinking behind her. Ahead, the road ran straight out into open country that seemed to have no edges at all, gray sky meeting gray grass, meeting a mountain range she'd later learn the locals called the Copper Spine. Though nothing about it looked like copper in that light. It looked like the end of something, or the start of it. She hadn't decided which yet, and that not deciding was going to matter more than she knew. Because what waited 12 frozen miles down that road wasn't just a house, and a stranger with her name, now legally tied to his. It was a debt nobody had told her about yet, a missing set of fence posts, and a decision that would take her the whole winter to make, even though, if she was honest with herself later, some part of her had already started making it by the second night. The 12 miles felt longer than they were. He drove without a word the entire way, hands loose on the reins because the horses clearly knew the road better than either of them needed to steer. She watched those hands instead of the scenery, still, unhurried, the hands of someone who'd learned a long time ago how to ration his own energy across a long distance, physical or otherwise. The ranch appeared out of the gray without warning. A low house, a barn built at twice its size, a fence line running toward a ridge that simply dissolved into the weather before it reached anything. Firewood was stacked 6 feet against the south wall of the barn, more wood than she'd seen in one place all winter, and she found herself staring at it a beat longer than she meant to. A man who kept that much would cut ahead of the season either planned carefully or was afraid of something. She didn't know yet which. He set the brake, climbed down, and came around for her trunk before she'd even gathered her skirts, and by the time he reached her side of the wagon she'd already climbed down herself. He noticed. Said nothing about it. She decided she liked that more than she expected to. Inside was warmer than the yard had any right to promise. A stove already lit, meaning either someone had been through earlier or he'd banked the fire before riding into town for her. She took in the room in one slow pass. A table, two mismatched chairs, a shelf with a random assortment of dishes, a second shelf holding 3 books and a single tin cup. And a doorway with no door at all, just a heavy wool curtain, behind which she could make out the corner of a bed frame. He set her trunk down beside that curtain. "That one's yours," he said. "I've moved a cot into the tack room off the barn. It stays warm enough, the horses see to that." She turned and looked at him properly for the first time since the platform. There was something careful in his face. Not quite caution, not quite anything else she had a name for yet. "That's your room," she said. "It was," he said, without any weight behind it, like a fact rather than a sacrifice. And she understood, standing there with snow still melting off her collar, that this hadn't been decided in the last 5 minutes. He'd already worked it out before she ever stepped off the train, and he wasn't waiting around for her to thank him for it. "All right," she said. He nodded once, crossed to the stove, and lifted the lid on a cast-iron pot. "There's venison. Give it an hour." She hung her coat on the peg by the door, found the water basin without asking where it was, and washed the travel off her hands and face, while the window over the sink went from gray to nearly black with the weight of the coming snow. The barn had already disappeared from view. "Flour?" she asked. "Second crate." "Under the beans?" She found it along with salt, lard, and a cracked ceramic bowl still perfectly usable, and she started mixing without measuring. Her hands remembering a recipe her mind hadn't thought about in years. He sat at the table with one of his 3 books, though she noticed he didn't turn a single page the whole time she worked the dough. The wind found the corner of the house and tested it once, like it was checking for weakness. He rose, stirred the venison, and stood a while at the window doing that particular thing men do when they're watching the weather and something else entirely at the same time. "Storm'll run through by morning," he said. Not a question, she didn't answer it as one. She shaped the dough into a round, covered it, and while it rose, she noticed things about the kitchen the way she'd noticed the woodpile outside, not looking for what was wrong exactly. Just looking for what was there. Bare timber walls, a calendar 3 years out of date, still nailed up like nobody had gotten around to needing a new one, a window with no curtain at all. She filed that last one away and said nothing. When she lifted the lid on the venison to check it, the smell told her he'd used dried onion and something else she couldn't place until she found the little paper twist tucked at the back of the shelf. Juniper, she hadn't expected a man alone on a Montana cattle operation to know what to do with juniper, and she put the lid back down without comment, filing that away too. They ate without ceremony. He served 2 plates without asking which she'd want, which turned out to be exactly right. She sliced the bread hot, and he ate 2 pieces of it without a word, and that silence told her more than praise would have. It was over the last of the broth that she decided to say what she'd been turning over since the train station. "I want the cattle count tomorrow morning," she said. He looked up. It wasn't surprise exactly, more an assessment, quick and unreadable, gone as fast as it came. "All right," he said. "And I heard something in town about rot on the south fence line." He was quiet a beat too long before he answered. 2 posts, I've got the lumber for it. We'll get to it once the ground softens enough to work." She nodded and ate, and didn't say what was sitting folded in her coat pocket at that very moment. The account ledger from the hardware store, which she'd glanced at while the owner's wife wrapped her flour purchase, and which listed 4 fence posts charged to this ranch's account back in October, 40 cents apiece, receipt pasted right into the page. Not 2, 4, she didn't know yet what that gap meant. Lumber gets repurposed. Books get kept sloppily by honest men and kept perfectly by men stealing from every direction at once. A missing pair of fence posts wasn't a verdict, but it was a fact, and she was the kind of woman who collected facts before she collected opinions. She cleared the plates. He didn't help and didn't leave the table either, sitting with his hands flat against the wood, not quite resting. The lamp guttered in a draft from somewhere and then steadied itself. "The last manager," she said at the window now, looking at nothing because there was nothing left to see through the glass. "How long was he here?" 3 seasons, he said. "When did he leave?" "September. Before the first hard frost. Did he take anything with him?" The silence that followed wasn't long. But it was the particular kind of silence a person makes while deciding not between a lie and the truth, but between the whole truth and some smaller, more survivable version of it. "A horse," he said finally, "one of the mares." I let it go. Why? Because winter was coming and I didn't have the appetite for a fight over one animal on top of everything else. She turned from the window. He was watching her with that same careful arithmetic in his face. She crossed the room and sat, not at the far end where she'd eaten, but in the chair he usually left empty, close enough that the lamp sat squarely between them. "The account at the hardware lists 4 posts," she said. "Ordered in October." He didn't look away. "I know, 2 went in." He looked down at his own hands like they might have an answer he didn't. "By the time he left, we were behind on the whole south stretch. I didn't find it until the first hard freeze locked the ground." She heard the shape of what he wasn't saying. That someone had told him the work was finished when it wasn't. She let it sit instead of pushing. "How many did you lose?" she said, not really a question, a measurement. 11 head, he said, through that stretch of fence. In one season. 11 animals, gone through a gap nobody had caught in time, in a place where every head of cattle was the difference between a good year and a hard one. She thought of the careful columns in the ledger she'd seen, his handwriting, she guessed, though she hadn't asked, and what it cost a man to keep faithful records of a loss he hadn't caused and couldn't undo. "Did you know before I got here that the fence was still bad?" "I knew in December," he said. "The week before your train came in." She looked at him. He was already looking at her, and for a moment neither of them moved, and the lamp between them was the only thing in that room with anything left to say about it. If a 30-second recap could capture what she understood in that exact minute, it would go like this. She had married a stranger sight unseen, and walked straight into the wreckage of something he hadn't finished grieving yet. Not the visible kind of wreckage, the kind a man carries around because he hasn't found anywhere to set it down. She wasn't sorry for him, exactly. That wasn't the right word. It was closer to recognition, the particular kind you feel when you meet someone else who's also spent a long stretch of time doing arithmetic on a loss in private. "Is the south fence sound now?" she asked. "As sound as I could make it alone. Is there a natural break in that section?" "A wash, a ridge, something the water follows." He gave her that same calibrating look. "A shallow wash." "Why? Because if you rebuild that line in spring without accounting for where the water actually runs, you'll be back here in 3 years having this exact conversation." She pulled the ledger toward her and opened to a blank page near the back and picked up the pencil sitting beside the lamp. He didn't speak. He stood, came around the table and sat beside her instead, close enough that she could hear him breathing, and she found she didn't mind that at all. She drew the wash first, a single loose curve, nothing fancy, just the shape water would take when the thaw came. "How far does it run?" 40 yards maybe before it flattens." She marked the distance with a short crosshatch. "Then your post line goes here instead of where it was. And here where it bends, you double the anchors, 2 posts braced in opposite directions instead of one standing alone." He was quiet a moment. "My father set that line in 68-69. The winters were wetter then. They were. Then he built for a wetter season, and the fence held exactly as long as it should have. That's not failure. That's just time doing what time does." Something in his jaw eased when she said it. Some small resistance she hadn't known was sitting there until it let go. He reached over and took the pencil from her without asking, and added a line she hadn't thought to add. The slope of the pasture beyond the wash, and the way it would push runoff east in a heavy melt. She studied it. He was right. She adjusted her post line to match and handed the pencil back without comment. They worked like that for the better part of an hour, and the temperature outside kept dropping, and neither of them moved to bank the fire because neither of them wanted to be the one to end it. The ledger filled slowly, not with numbers this time, but with the actual shape of the land. Translated onto a page by 2 people who'd only met that afternoon and were already arguing productively about drainage. At one point she asked about the northwest pasture, and the pause before he answered told her there was something out there he hadn't fully worked through yet. "Grass comes in thin," he said. "Always has. Soil, rocky, cattle don't love it, but they use it when they have to." "Then you don't fence it tight," she said. "You're not going to fix the ground. So you change how you use it instead. Let them move through on their own terms." "Write it down," he said, and she did. By the time the fire had burned low enough that the room's chill finally reached them both, neither of them had noticed how long they'd been sitting shoulder to shoulder, working, without once looking for a reason to stop. The deep cold arrived that week in earnest, not the workable cold of early December, but the kind that came down off the mountains like it had a grudge to settle. It froze the trough before sunrise and bunched the herd tight along the southern fence, breath rising off them in slow gray columns. He was out before light every morning after that. She'd hear the door, watch the lantern swing its way toward the barn from the kitchen window. And somewhere in that second week, she started leaving coffee on the back of the stove without saying anything about it. Not set out at the table, nothing that looked like a gesture, just kept warm for whenever he came in from the cold. He never mentioned it either. But the cup was always empty by the time she came down, and he always set it back in exactly the same spot. The upper hay stack needed bringing down, which meant the sledge, which meant a runner he'd been putting off fixing since October. She found him in the barn one afternoon with it pulled apart across two sawhorses, hands gone red working a brace against split wood. She didn't say a word. She just picked up the far end of the brace and held it steady while he worked, and they stayed like that the better part of an hour, wind finding every gap in the barn siding. Lantern throwing long shadows across the loose hay. When the runner was back on and tested, he looked at her hands still holding the tool. "You'll want to warm those," he said, and it was the most he'd said all day, and somehow it landed like more than that. Inside, he poured water off the back of the stove, and she wrapped both hands around the cup while he sat down at the table still in his coat, like he hadn't quite decided to stay. She found herself thinking about the map they'd drawn together, the fence line, the decisions already committed to ink and not easily walked back. She thought about how naturally the word, "we," had settled into their conversations without either of them ever choosing it out loud. They ate cold biscuits and the last of the salt pork and 3 eggs she cracked into the pan without asking his preference, because by then she didn't need to ask anymore. "North fence near the creek bed's going to need work before spring," he said. "Frost is already shifting the posts." "I've seen it," she said. He nodded, said he'd start there once the hauling was done for the week, and she said that made sense, and the quiet that followed wasn't empty. It had shape to it by then. It had become the ordinary rhythm of the house. She was up before the light most mornings now, building the fire by feel, damper, kindling. The match struck against the stove's iron side, and she'd started leaving the ledger open on the table before he came down, his coffee set beside it like a challenge she fully expected him to accept. One morning he stood in the doorway looking at the open page a long moment before he sat. "If you're going to argue with my numbers," she said from the stove, "you should read them first." He read. She could hear it in the way the silence changed shape as he moved down the columns. "You've got us buying 30 head in March," he said. 28, she said. 30 if the ground's still hard and the price has dropped by then. "Where are you planning to run them?" she told him, the south pasture. The question mark hanging over whether the creek at the low corner would hold through a dry summer. He listened without cutting in, and when she finished, he turned his cup on the table a while, which she'd learned by then wasn't doubt. It was just how he thought out loud through his hands before the words caught up. "There's a spring nobody's used on the north slope," he said. "Willard's old parcel. He went back east years ago and nobody's touched it since. Reliable, I'll go check." That was how the two of them talked, she was realizing, not in conclusions, but in doors left open for the other one to walk through. One of them would push on something and find it gave, and they'd both go through it together. He came back at midday with mud to his knees and said the spring ran deep, probably fed from higher on the ridge than anyone had ever bothered tracing. He said it the way he said most things, like a plain fact and nothing more. She told him what that meant for the numbers, and he set his hat on the peg and stood there a moment with his back to her. "All right," he said. It wasn't a large thing to say, but she understood, standing there with flour still on her hands, that it wasn't small either. They spread the map across the table that afternoon, corners held down with a coffee cup, a jar of nails, one of her thimbles, his folding knife. It was a hand-drawn thing, wrong in places where the original surveyor had clearly been guessing. and they'd both learned to read around its errors and trust their own boots over its lines. She had penciled in the north pasture herself, lightly, provisionally, because it hadn't been there before. It didn't look provisional anymore. He traced the fence line with one finger, not pressing, just following it, and stopped where the terrain broke toward the creek drainage. The one question they hadn't settled yet. Whether the grade there was worth fencing, or would cost more than it would ever return. "We could run it higher," she said, "along the shoulder of the hill. Lose less ground than it looks like from here." He studied that line a long moment, then nodded once, and that was the entire conversation. She rolled the map from her end. He held his end steady until she reached it, and he let go exactly when she needed him to. Outside, the light had gone the particular blue of late afternoon with snow still on the ground, shadows stretching long and soft across the yard. She could see the corner of the spring enclosure he'd repaired back in November, one post noticeably newer than the rest, catching the light differently than its neighbors. She'd noticed it every day for 3 months by then and had never once mentioned it because there was nothing that needed saying. It was simply there, the way certain things just are. He crouched by the fire a while with his hands out toward the heat, and she put water on, and she found herself thinking that these were hours she had never expected to have. She'd braced herself for the work, for the cold, for the long stretches of silence a winter like this demanded. She hadn't braced herself for this, the particular ease of a house where two people understood the same things without needing to translate them for each other. Where a map could be rolled up and put away, and both of them would still carry the exact same picture of it through supper and into the next day. She hadn't had that before. She hadn't even known she was missing it until it stopped being missing. He stacked extra wood inside the door before supper, because it would drop below freezing again that night, and she hadn't needed to ask him to. After they ate, she washed and he dried, setting each dish back on the shelf in precisely the order she kept them. Something he'd learned in the first 3 weeks and never once gotten wrong since. Though she'd never told him, it mattered to her. The lamp burned low between them. She thought about the map, about how the pencil lines had gone from guesses to something solid over the course of one winter. A creek that had a name now, because she'd walked its whole length herself. A ridge that wasn't a shape on paper anymore, but a weight her legs remembered from climbing it. This wasn't a business arrangement anymore, whatever the paperwork in the drawer said. It was land. It was the number of animals that could winter safely on it. It was the direction the worst wind came from, and she knew that now the same way she knew which shelf held the good bowl, because she had stayed long enough to learn it properly. He set his cup down and looked at the table for a moment, then toward the dark window. She hadn't planned to stay past the winter. She'd known that going in, had held it deliberately as a kind of door left open behind her, an exit she could use once the season turned, and she'd had a proper chance to assess her situation. Spring in her plan was supposed to be a decision point. Spring had come, and she had assessed it. And the answer had arrived the way most real answers do, not in a single dramatic moment, but across 100 small ones, a coffee cup left warm on the stove, a ledger column argued over at dawn. A fence post noticed and never mentioned, until one evening she looked up and realized she was already living on the other side of the decision she'd told herself she hadn't made yet. He looked at her then, not in a way that needed an answer. Just looked the same unhurried way he sometimes did in the early mornings when the stove was barely catching and the day hadn't made its first demand on either of them yet. She held his eye a moment. Then she rose and put the lamp out, because it was late, because the mornings out here always started early regardless of what happened the night before. And because there was still a great deal of country between them that neither of them had walked yet, and for the first time since the train pulled into Thistledown. That felt less like an ending waiting to happen, and more like exactly the kind of unfinished thing worth staying for. The door to the yard stayed latched against the cold the whole night through. And when the light came up over the copper spine the next morning, it found that new fence post at the corner of the spring enclosure catching the sun the same as all the others. No longer the newest thing out there, no longer standing apart. Just part of the line now, the same as everything else that had finally settled into place. So that's where I'll leave the two of them, right at the start of a spring neither one saw coming when that train pulled in back in November. If you'd gotten off at that platform, alone, 12 miles from a stranger who'd already given up his own bedroom before you even arrived, would you have stayed through that first winter? Or would you have been back on the next train out? Tell me where you're watching this from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you want more of this kind of slow burn, land and longing story, hit like, subscribe, and drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them.